and welcome to our third episode of Issues, where we at Volunteer Maine take a look at how service and volunteerism can tackle some of the state's largest challenges. My name is Brian Roach. I'm the Communications Officer for Volunteer Maine, and we're thrilled you're with us for episode 3. We already have 2 in the bank, and we have a familiar guest with us here too. But before we bring in all of our guests, let's just set the scene to today's episode, because episode 3 for us, it is a big one. We'll be diving into some of the findings and data behind COVID-19's impact on Maine's volunteering sector. And I want to just read a passage from the survey that will be driving our discussion today. This is in the introduction. So the impact of COVID-19 has been widespread across all facets of life in Maine, and particularly acute within the nonprofit sector, which relies heavily on volunteers to accomplish their work. However, the extent of the impact, how organizations are adjusting to COVID-19, and what sort of supports they need to rebuild their volunteer base is not yet known. To this end, Volunteer Maine reached out to the Data Innovation Project and the Survey Research Center at the Cutler Institute for Health and Social Policy at the University of Southern Maine to conduct an assessment of volunteering capacity at nonprofit organizations around Maine. The purpose of the survey was to better understand the impact of COVID-19 on the nonprofit volunteer base, identify innovative solutions to the current situation, and gain useful insight into how Volunteer Maine and its member sites can effectively contribute to the recovery efforts in communities across Maine. I figured I would read the passage. It's much more eloquent than what I would put together for an introduction. So without any further ado, let's bring in today's guests. First, we have Sarah Goan, the Director of the Data Innovation Project at the Cutler Institute within the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine. I know you folks are also tied to the University of Maine Graduate and Professional Center as well. So she has over a decade of experience in evaluation and research related to programs that enhance child and family well-being, and is passionate about telling the story of data and evaluation. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. As a former short-term employee of Muskie before being plucked to the larger university level, I know how important it is to get all those names in. So I want to make sure we gave everyone credit. But again, thank you so much for joining us.
You did a great job, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad it's been since 2017 since I've had to pull out the full string. So I'm glad I'm not too rusty.
It's a long one.
But we also have Kelsey Preecs back with us for her second consecutive episode in the hot seat. Kelsey, of course, is our program manager for volunteer initiatives at Volunteer Maine, and will be one of the folks on the team using the survey results to help guide the work of volunteer managers through this brave new world that we are now facing. And again, I guess we should just throw in this little caveat. We are recording at the end of August, right as the Delta variant of COVID-19 is starting to surge. So once the survey was completed and presented back to us, that was right around June, and the outlook was looking a lot more optimistic. With that being said, that should not impact the findings in our discussion here today. Just want to mention that to folks before we get too deep into it. So, Sarah, we'll start with you as the author and project manager of this survey. Let's just start at a really high level. And before we get into the how of the survey, could you first walk folks through some of the key conclusions and recommendations that you and the team found?
Sure thing, Brian, and thanks again for having me here with you today. So first of all, I do just want to point out that our results really represent the perspectives and experiences of those who responded to our survey, which was over 100 organizations around the state, but they may not represent the full range of experiences for the entire nonprofit sector. But that said, the survey respondents reported that volunteering at their organizations decreased during COVID-19, and some opportunities were severely limited, particularly in-person activities, and often those related to the direct delivery of their services. And volunteering for professional and general labor also decreased. So kind of office work or operations work also decreased, although often boards and work groups were able to continue. So that was a bright light that some of the work was able to continue in that format. One-time volunteer opportunities also were eliminated or reduced, and overall volunteer hours decreased. These aren't necessarily surprising findings, but they are certainly the experiences of those who responded to the survey. And some of the biggest factors that survey respondents said were impacting volunteer efforts during the pandemic were event size and headcount limitations, as well as the changing service needs of the community that they were serving and temporary office closures. But nonetheless, respondents shared many ways in which their volunteering efforts were recovering. So transitioning to virtual or remote opportunities, offering opportunities related to the pandemic, such as checking in with community members by telephone or staffing vaccine clinics or making contactless deliveries to homes. And perhaps even better news is that most of the organizations said they maintained their capacity to support volunteering to some degree, even if that capacity had been somewhat diminished or put on hold during the pandemic while they needed to shift gears. So to sum up, looking ahead, because we also asked, what sorts of supports might they need looking ahead, most organizations responded that they weren't overly concerned about their volunteer capacity, but they did highlight some key areas where they thought Volunteer Maine could support them. So this was how to recruit volunteers to return and the messaging around that, particularly for remote or virtual settings, which sometimes weren't as exciting to their volunteer base, ways to bring them back safely, including safe practice checklists and other guidelines for how to safely reopen their organizations and their events and their volunteering to volunteers.
And thank you, Sarah, first of all, for taking us through that and just being on the staff at the beginning of the pandemic. It was incredible to see, especially the programs that we work really closely with, just to see how the majority of them were willing to adapt. Yes, there were some pain points, but I think one big takeaway, at least for me, is that, as you said, to lead off your answer, volunteering didn't stop. And that's huge. So on that, I do want to bring in Kelsey, and you've had some time to digest the survey findings yourself. And again, at a high level, I want to get your first impressions before we go too deep. What, from your perspective, in the results really jumped out to you?
Sure. All groups, no matter the size, big, small, in between sectors, everyone was affected by COVID. Nobody was immune to it. Big organizations and small organizations alike had to figure out how to pivot. But I thought it was really interesting, as Sarah alluded to, everybody kept trying to engage their volunteers. And while it couldn't stay exactly the same as it was, and I'm sure there were a lot of people who, remote volunteer work didn't appeal to them as much, or they weren't able to for whatever reason, organizations tried to engage their volunteers, and people were willing to be engaged. They were looking for that connection. And especially in a time when an older demographic we were really looking out for them. It was a really scary time, and we wanted to make sure that they weren't coming in and that sort of thing. A younger demographic really stood up and tried to engage more, or more than they had. So again, volunteering didn't stop, which is really exciting to see. So then looking forward, how do we sort of harness that energy of knowing that people want to volunteer and they're willing to, and what does that look like, especially as you had mentioned with this Delta variant coming through? We sort of have an idea of ways that we can. So how do we harness that energy and make sure that we can keep engaging people?
And thank you for that, Kelsey. And we're going to get back into some of the findings in just a few moments. But before we do, as I alluded to myself, want to talk a little bit about the how behind this survey. So Sarah, if I can turn it back to you, could you explain to the audience the methodology, behind the survey? Who did you and the Data Innovation Project team recruit to participate? How was the survey administered? And anything else that you'd like to mention?
Sure, and apologies if this is a little bit long-winded. There's a lot
No
to
problem.
unpack here in the how. But like you mentioned in the introduction, the purpose of the survey was to better understand the impact of COVID-19 on the nonprofit volunteer base. And so our intended audience for the survey was really nonprofits and other organizations which rely upon volunteers. And in particular, we hope to reach the individuals within organizations who oversee volunteer management. And that is sometimes a different person depending on how the organization is set up. We recruited survey participants in early spring 2021 in a couple different ways. So first, we sent out announcements through newsletters that target the nonprofit sector. So that included our own Data Innovation Project newsletter, Volunteer Maine's newsletter and mailing lists. The Maine Association of Nonprofits sent out a little announcement, the Maine Public Health Association as well. And we shared information about the survey and its intended audience, and we asked people to participate by providing us with their contact information. We linked to a very short form that provided us the appropriate contact information for that organization. We also just randomly selected a little over 100 organizations from Volunteer Maine's newsletter and mailing lists to invite those organizations to participate. And we did a little bit of web searching in that case to verify the proper contact information at the organizations and who to reach out to. So once we had this pool of just over 220, I believe, potential survey participants, we then worked with the Survey Research Center at USM to get the survey online and distribute a link to both the direct recruits and the random sample where we had that contact information. And then the Survey Research Center was able to conduct follow-up telephone calls with folks when we had their telephone contact information to try to get our response rates up, to have a little reminder, have you filled out the survey? In some cases, they're able to actually go through the survey with an individual on the telephone if necessary. And then finally, in May 2021, we sent an anonymous link out through a couple different channels just to see if we could get a final boost of responses. And altogether, we got 122 completed surveys. A few folks started, but then dropped off, which happens. And that was about half of the people that we contacted directly. And so I'd also like to mention that we designed the survey questionnaire by reviewing research, surveys, assessments related to nonprofits and volunteering. We also consulted with Volunteer Maine's Research and Evaluation Committee, and their members helped articulate the purpose, reviewed some of the questions, they provided feedback. We had a little bit of back and forth, shared some drafts with them. And then the final survey instrument consisted of 39 total questions to explore the impact of COVID-19 on volunteer activity, management practices, and the organization's response and recovery. And we also, of course, asked what could be done to help going forward. And the questions were a mix of kind of that scaled question on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree type of question, as well as open-ended responses saying, please explain your answer or provide more information if you weren't able to share that in the previous questions that we'd already asked you. And that just makes sure that folks have a chance to share important themes that we maybe didn't ask about.
And again, the way that some of these organizations pivoted, the fact that, I'll give them kudos for taking the time to actually fill out this survey, for providing us this detailed information, because I know with me sometimes, especially when I get a survey, some people just think of it, or it could be thought as, oh, this is daunting. This is an extra task. I don't have the time for this. But really, the responses are crucial, especially in this changing environment, for us and how we guide our work. So thank you for taking us through that. And I would like to bring it back to Kelsey again. I think I actually structured it out even this week, folks, where we'll go back and forth. But Kelsey, we'll dive into some of the numbers. 66% of survey respondents said that COVID-19 had worsened their ability to continue operating in the community, and 44% were greatly or moderately concerned about the longer-term impacts of the pandemic impact on capacity. What are some of those concerns related to volunteer management, and how can we as a commission help to mitigate them?
Sure. So, I think that probably reflects on how a lot of organizations probably took a hit as far as like their fiscal things, whether that be through donors or just funding sources in general. It made it so that it was a lot more challenging to maintain staff or get new staff that they had hoped to get. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, something like a volunteering manager is often kind of lower on the priority. It just is how organizations sometimes have to operate, and that's unfortunate. So, when you talk about how does volunteer management fit into that, we at Volunteer Maine focus on, provide, feel very strongly about a form called service enterprise. And service enterprise is really more than a philosophy, but I'll call it a philosophy of really engaging your volunteers at all levels, all areas of your work. I think it's really common for organizations to have sort of those boots on the ground, like front-facing volunteers who help maybe pass out services, and then have board members, right? So like very, and there's a lot in between of that. So service enterprise really wants to engage volunteers in all those other aspects. Or do you have people who really like your mission, who maybe are really good at accounting and could help you crunch your numbers? Maybe you have some volunteers or people who are passionate about your mission who could just help with some basic office work. It's all across the board too. Maintenance staff even. And the point of that is really to help alleviate the pressure on staff to be able to handle all those back end areas that can just really suck up time, to really allowing people to come in with their gifts and their passions to just help you not have to focus on that. So that's something that I would encourage, any organizations who are listening to us right now, do a little search on service enterprise, because we offer the training, we offer the support, and it can be so helpful for organizations to really just engage more volunteers. And the more volunteers you have, the more support you have, and the more people in your community who are advocating for you to other people. And it just grows the people who understand your work, who want to get involved in your work. And that's really important, especially in this time where a lot of people have to be a little bit more careful about where they're giving their time and their money. So the more people you have engaged, the more opportunity you have to get your mission out into your community and to leverage that.
Thank you for that, Kelsey. No, I was going to say too, we've been talking a lot about service enterprise in the office, and again, just another organization that is preparing to help out volunteers, of course, through Points of Light Institute, navigate these changing times. So Sarah, I want to focus on the rural serving organizations for a quick second. Survey indicates that rural serving organizations are more likely to report reductions or eliminations in staff, more likely to indicate that internet access technology is a concern, really not a surprise there, and more likely to indicate transportation and travel limitations as barriers to serve. How does the data say these factors are impacting volunteer recruitment and retention?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to answer it, but I wanted to piggyback on what Kelsey said in her previous answer about different ways to engage volunteers. In a lot of the coaching that I do with nonprofits, we are always encouraging them to look to their volunteer base for the hidden data experts and data gurus as well. That's an area where a lot of nonprofits don't have dedicated staff capacity, and there are hidden data experts within their volunteer pool and their board membership that may really be able to build that capacity for them. So I just wanted to do a little plug for that aspect of the work as well.
Of course.
Data. So back to your original question. Yeah, that's a really interesting area that we were able to explore, because just about half of the organizations that responded to the survey were serving in an area that's considered rural according to the USDA's designation. And so you're right, they were more likely to say that internet access and travel and transport limitations had affected their volunteering negatively. And they were concerns expressed by volunteers, and that limited their ability to engage in certain volunteer activities. But what I thought was really interesting was that while the rural serving organizations were more likely to state that recruiting new volunteers was a concern going forward, they tended to be much less worried about volunteer attrition and retention than their non-rural peers. And I think the lower concern about retention and attrition suggests that they have a real dedicated volunteer base and they're not worried about that base leaving. But the concern over recruitment is probably tied to the fact that these rural serving organizations were also more likely to report that they had had to reduce the staffing available to support volunteering. And we know that a lot of time and energy really goes into that recruitment piece.
I do want to make sure we at least touch on this, and I'll leave it open to either of you. And we touched on it just a little bit, but the demographics and Maine shifting volunteer population, or at least that's what it looks like in the data. Sarah or Kelsey, whoever wants to take it, if you could just talk us through some of those findings.
I'll start. I mean, when the pandemic first happened, first started getting information, it was really clear that, an over certain age was greatly affected. And Maine is unique in the sense that we have the oldest population in the country. I mean, a lot of our community members are 65 plus. And that also translates to a lot of volunteers being 65 plus, it makes sense. But a lot of organizations had to say, if you're of a certain age, we can't have you come in, because they recognize the risk and they don't want to put their volunteers at risk. They don't want anybody to get sick or hurt. That they had to look at the risk evaluation of that. And so, there's looking at the fact that those people were unable to come in the regular sense of volunteering. And, that also shows, we also talked about how a lot of people ended up doing remote stuff, which I'm sure helped a lot of those people stay connected. But that also means that a lot of the volunteers who were showing up were of a younger demographic. And I don't, maybe Sarah can answer this, but I don't know that we can say that like more young people showed up per se, but because an older generation was unable to, it made it so that the majority of the volunteers were younger. I guess I would argue that it was a time when people were looking to stay connected and looking to help. So I wouldn't be shocked if more people showed up to volunteer who were younger, who normally wouldn't have. But it's sort of hard to tell, especially since we don't have those specific numbers from before to say like, oh yeah, and then there was a huge surge of, 30% more 25-year-olds showed up. We can't necessarily say that, but clearly, because 65 plus was unable to do the regular volunteering, the demographic shifted to lower.
Yeah, and I'll jump in to say that, really the most conclusive thing that we can say based on the survey results, which were the observations of the people responding to the survey. So, that's a step away from actual hard demographic data or census data around who was actually volunteering. It's their anecdotal observation. But they certainly all did report a decrease in older volunteers. It was 44%, and the rest, just about all of them said it had stayed the same. So it maintained or decreased. But then the rest of it was kind of shifting patterns, and there wasn't anything clear that emerged. And it seemed like it depended on each organization, who was in their base to start with, what sorts of opportunities they might be offering. And so there was really no crystal clear pattern that emerged based on their observations as a group as to which way the demographics had shifted. Although first-time volunteers and younger volunteers were, about a third of them were seeing and reporting that trend of younger and first-time volunteers. But the patterns were really murky, and I think there's more to see and more to learn about that.
Well, thank you both for that. And I will take the optimist's look at this and just point out the fact that, again, it's state of Maine known for its service, its volunteerism, and the fact that there's a younger generation, given some of the messaging that could be found on the platforms used by the younger generation, says the 30-year-old who is saying, "Get off my lawn." All to say, it's heartwarming. So we'll rein it back in. We'll bring it to Kelsey. And focusing on the state of volunteering, that section, in the report. During the pandemic, the survey reports that 83% of the respondents had continued some degree of volunteer activities, and of those, 58 reported they've experienced some degree of negative impact on volunteer attendance. While it's great to see the majority continue to find ways to volunteer, of the concerns listed, How can we use this data to help volunteer leaders overcome some of these challenges?
Sure. Some of the barriers that were talked about in the research and the data that came out, transportation and internet were a couple of the top ones. And we as a commission can certainly help, to advocate for more of that. And we have, the commission has AmeriCorps projects that are looking at that kind of stuff, and we want to continue to advocate for the importance of that, especially in our rural communities. One of the other things that we talk about, and this, I'll like to point out that this happens no matter what the landscape looks like. Volunteer recruitment is always top of mind for volunteer managers. I mean, it doesn't matter if we're in COVID or just regular times, whatever that's going to look like. We're always thinking about, well, how do we recruit? And I guess I would encourage, ourselves and organizations to kind of take the momentum of people like wanting to get connected again. That we have a vaccine out. We know a lot more than we did at the beginning. At first we weren't sure like how people were getting infected as much, and we have a lot clearer understanding and a lot clearer guidelines. So we always look to the CDC to, how do you do processes that are safe for everybody? And so that's, where we will always be pointing people to. But harnessing that energy that people want to get connected again, they want that human interaction, or they want to feel connected to other humans, use that as leverage almost to talk about recruitment. And I think, we saw a lot of people step up in a big way during COVID. And so people want to help. And I think if we can continue to look to the CDC for safe guidelines and be creative about how we engage our volunteers and try to think a little bit more outside the box, there will be great, safe ways to engage them. And also, I'll say, tying a little bit back more into like the service enterprise, like trusting our volunteers, like trusting them and giving them the power and the responsibility to do maybe a little bit more than we had originally thought. They can get a little bit more engaged in our organization than we had originally planned. That's exciting stuff. And I think, it's going to look different for a long time, and it might change again. We might be having this conversation again in a couple of months saying, oh, we got to do something different, or not, hopefully. But, people want to help and they want to stay engaged. And so sit down. I would encourage groups to like sit down and really think about, how do we keep our people engaged with us, and doing us. I think it's possible. I'm not going to say that, it'll all go back to normal and it'll solve all your problems, but it's really important. And I think keeping people connected to their nonprofits, to their community, is hugely beneficial for everyone.
Well, the survey certainly is, or the survey report, I should say, it certainly is an interesting read for anyone that is interested in the impact, not only that COVID's having on society, but especially the volunteerism sector. I know that I was able to pull a lot from it, not nearly having the level of expertise as some of my colleagues, being more on the communication side of things, but it was extremely insightful. And I know for Kelsey, it's going to help guide a lot of her work. I know it's going to guide a lot of the commission's work, and the suggestions about messaging outreach, it's given me a lot to think about too, and how we try to engage and encourage folks to participate in these new ways to serve. And again, we say new ways to serve, knowing that some changes, especially you think about virtual meetings, those are going to stick around for a while. But of course, we do want to be optimistic and hope that, we'll be able to get big groups back together again safely sooner rather than later. So before we wrap up, let's just take folks behind the curtain a little bit. Kelsey, could you first explain to folks how we partnered up with the Data Innovation Project? And then second, Sarah, how would you sum up your experience working with the volunteer sector and Volunteer Maine? And you can be honest.
So the irony of that question is that we were already hooked up with Sarah and her team before I showed up. But my understanding is we just wanted to make sure that the data we were getting was collected correctly and touched, across the state, all sectors within the nonprofit world. So it made sense to partner with a group that did that all the time and was, knew what needed to happen, knew the correct questions to ask and how to ask them and how to find people who maybe we didn't know. So that's why, we looked into that. It just made sense for us to make sure that we were having a really non-biased survey that went out and collected as much information, helpful information that we could.
Yeah, definitely. And I can go into the background a little bit as well. We've been helping to support Volunteer Maine's grantees with data literacy and data collection capacity building for the last 2 years. And that really has been building off a body of work the Data Innovation Project has created to help build data-informed capacity across Maine's mission-driven organizations. We've been doing that work for the past 5 years around the state. I can't even count the number of organizations we've had some sort of contact with. And one of the things I love most about that type of work is that we get to be so connected to the community through the work that we do with these organizations. And so the survey itself was a great opportunity for us to deepen that work and our collaboration with Volunteer Maine and really dig into some of these important questions about the volunteer sector during COVID. I think it's been a real partnership and a learning experience for both of us. Collaborating with the Research and Evaluation Committee, with the Commission, with Volunteer Maine staff it's really been collaborative, and we both learned, I think, through this process. And while some of the findings confirmed what we thought, it was really uplifting to read about the ways in which organizations have been responding to the pandemic and the role that volunteers have played in that response. And I just think it really highlights the critical role of nonprofits and volunteers in Maine. And we were just pleased to be part of the study and hopefully contribute to the ongoing recovery in some small way.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kelsey. And Sarah, I will say too, it is, again, knowing just how dedicated the folks at Muskie are in general. I'm going to use that as the umbrella here.
Sure.
And the University of Southern Maine. It is a great partnership for us to have with the state because, again, as we mentioned, there's a lot of great insight to take away from this survey, and hopefully through all these efforts, we all collectively can help out these folks who champion volunteer causes throughout the state of Maine. So before we wrap it up, I will mention that we will have the survey, or at least some of the findings, available on the Volunteer Maine website. We'll put that in our news section and our reports section. And when this episode comes out, we will have the link for you right in the episode description, as well as we'll probably put a little graphic up at the bottom too. Graphics work, people. But
You're here first.
but with that, I want to thank Sarah Goan, Director of the Data Innovation Project, Kelsey Preecs, Program Officer for Volunteer Sector Initiatives here at Volunteer Maine, so much for being a part of episode 3 of Issues. And again, we'll put in the episode description, be it on our website or on YouTube, how you can learn more about the Data Innovation Project and some links to take a look at their organization within the larger University of Southern Maine. So Kelsey, Sarah, thank you both again. Really enjoyed the conversation. And I have to say, from a production standpoint, this was the smoothest one we've done so far.
We killed it.
We might be ready to do this live. So if we can do the 2022 Maine Volunteer Leadership Conference back in person, maybe that's our big event. We do a live episode of Issues.
That's actually pretty cool.
Well, it's been my pleasure. So thank you so much.
Oh, no problem. No problem at all. Thanks again, everyone. And we'll be back next month. We can't quite tell you what we're going to be talking about, like we were able to tease this one, but we do have several topics lined up over the next few months. So we will be bringing you regular episodes of Issues. And again, too, folks, send us some feedback. One thing I want to know is if you would like this in podcast format, please do leave a comment, reach out to our office. We'll put some contact information that will help us guide the direction of this production, but we know some folks are enjoying it. And we hope to bring it to some more folks. So with all that being said, thank you again for tuning in. My name is Brian Roach, Communications Officer for Volunteer Maine. This has been Issues, and we hope that you have a great month. We'll talk to you really soon.